Welcome to Episode 2 of Why Men Fight, Bertrand Russell's Vision for Peace and Progress. Today we ask a foundational question. What truly drives human behavior, reason, or impulse?
And how do our institutions shape that battle within us?
We're diving deep into Bertrand Russell's insights, specifically from his really powerful work, Why Men Fight.
Yeah, written right in the middle of World War I. It's quite something.
Exactly. And it's not just about the war itself, is it? It's more about what that kind of crisis tells us about, well, us, about the basic drives of human action.
Right. Our mission today really is to unpack what Russell calls the springs of human action, these fundamental drives.
And to explore the hope he saw, maybe surprisingly, for political institutions to actually help foster peace and progress. But only if they get a handle on these deep drivers.
It's fascinating because Russell, looking around during that massive conflict, felt that political thinking had kind of missed the mark on human motivation.
How so?
Well, he argues that traditional philosophy, it focused almost entirely on just one source of what we do, desire.
Desire. Okay, that seems pretty straightforward, right? Like, you want something specific. A promotion, a coffee.
Exactly. It's conscious. You know what you want. You're thinking about a future result, some kind of satisfaction down the line.
There's that gap, like you said, between wanting and getting.
Precisely. Russell sees desire involving that interval. And things like willpower, forcing yourself to do something unpleasant now for a future reward.
Like studying for an exam instead of going out.
That's pure desire territory, according to Russell. It's where we feel we're being rational, in control.
But Russell says that's not the full picture, maybe not even the main driver.
Yeah, that's the twist. He brings in this other source, often working under the surface, impulse.
Impulse. Okay, what does he mean by that exactly?
It's the more instinctive stuff, often blind, he says. The key thing is when you act from impulse, you're focused on the activity itself, not some planned-out goal or consequence.
So like a kid suddenly bursting into running and shouting.
Perfect example. Or a dog barking at the moon. They aren't thinking, this action will achieve X. They're just doing it. The impulse is the reason.
They're not making a strategic calculation about lunar interaction.
Exactly. Russell lists things like eating, drinking, falling in love, quarreling, even boasting.
Boasting. That's interesting.
Yeah, he points out that while these things often lead to something satisfying, like eating stops hunger, the primary motive isn't always that future satisfaction. It can just be the immediate urge to act.
So the boaster might boast just out of that sudden impulse, even if, deep down, they suspect people won't actually be impressed.
That's his point. Sometimes they boast knowing they might be despised for it. The impulse overrides the calculation of consequences.
And as adults, we like to think we're beyond all that, don't we? We're the rational ones, not like kids or dogs.
We do. Russell suggests we sort of unconsciously cover up how much impulse drives us. We prefer the story that we're driven by desire and reason.
So when does the desire part come in then?
Often, it only really becomes conscious when an impulse gets blocked or checked. Suddenly, you desire the outcome the impulse was heading towards.
Ah, okay. So if you feel the impulse to shout but hold back, you might then become aware of a desire for the release shouting would bring.
Something like that. And if the likely consequences of following the impulse look bad, well, reason might win out if the impulse is weak.
But if it's strong?
Then, Russell says, we tend to just ignore the consequences, forget them, or even recklessly accept them. Think Macbeth, right? Driven by ambition, knows it leads to doom, but the impulse is too strong.
Wow. So a lot of what we call thinking or reasoning could just be our brain scrambling to justify what our impulse has already decided.
That's a really challenging part of his argument. He suggests much of our thought is just creating fictitious desires or quasi-rational grounds to make our impulsive actions seem logical after the fact.
Like reverse engineering a reason.
Pretty much. Genuine thought, for Russell, is rarer. It comes from pure intellectual curiosity, wanting to understand things. Most other thinking might just be serving an impulse.
So impulse is more fundamental. It's the engine, and desire is, what, the paint job?
That's a great way to put it. He says impulse is at the basis of our activity, much more than desire. Desire often acts as a garment, clothing the underlying impulse.
But he also calls impulse erratic and anarchical. It sounds kind of dangerous, unpredictable.
It can be. Because it's blind, meaning it doesn't spring from predicting consequences, it can look totally mad to someone who doesn't share that particular impulse.
And that difference in fundamental impulse could be the real root of disagreements that look like they're about logic.
He strongly suggests that. If the underlying drivers are fundamentally different, logical argument might be pointless. You're not even starting from the same place.
Which brings us back to war. If war looks like madness, the obvious reaction is, we just need more reason. But Russell pushes back on that.
He does, quite strongly. He agrees reason is important, the desire to think truly is valuable. But on its own, it's too negative, too little living. It doesn't have the power to overcome strong impulses.
So what can control an impulse?
And here's a key Russell insight. Only passion can control passion. He argues only a contrary impulse or desire is strong enough to check another impulse.
So preventing war isn't just about teaching logic, it's about changing the whole life of impulse.
Exactly. Changing the impulses that dominate in individuals and in societies.
But how do you change impulses? They feel so deep, so built in.
They are deep and, yes, blind. But Russell sees a crucial duality here. This same blind impulse, the source of awful things like war, is also the source of the very best things. Science, art, love.
So it's not about getting rid of impulse altogether.
Definitely not. He warns against trying to crush impulse with sheer willpower. He thinks that's exhausting, it drains vitality, and can even create worse impulses, like cruelty born from excessive self-control or discipline.
Okay, so the goal isn't suppression, but
Right.
redirection.
Yes, to direct our impulses towards life and growth, rather than towards death and decay.
And how does that happen? How do impulses get directed?
This is where society and institutions come in. This is the critical link. Russell states very clearly, a man's impulses are not fixed. They are profoundly modified by his circumstances and his way of life.
So our environment, our upbringing, the rules we live by, they actively shape these fundamental drives.
Absolutely. Which means, he argues, we have to study how our political and social institutions affect our impulses. And we need to judge those institutions based on whether they foster life-affirming impulses or destructive ones.
Okay, let's apply this to the war he was living through, WWI. He saw that primarily as impulse-driven.
Overwhelmingly so. He identifies the two main impulses fueling it as aggression and resistance to aggression.
Simple enough, attack and defend.
On the surface. But he digs into how each impulse generates its own set of beliefs to justify itself.
So the impulse of aggression leads people to believe
That their own group is inherently superior, the chosen people idea. They start seeing other groups as just material for their own triumph. He points to imperialism, but also historical examples like early religious conquests or parts of the Old Testament. The belief serves the impulse.
and the impulse of resistance. What beliefs does that create?
It generates a belief in the exceptional wickedness of the aggressor and an equally strong belief in the immense value of whatever customs or ways of life feel threatened.
So the things you're defending suddenly become sacred.
Exactly. He gives this striking example of political reactionaries in Britain and France, people who'd always opposed democracy. But when war broke out with Germany, they suddenly became its fiercest defenders.
Because Germany was seen as anti-democratic.
Precisely. They thought they valued democracy and hated Germany because Germany opposed it. But Russell flips it. He argues they hated Germany first, fueled by the impulse of resistance, and then they started valuing democracy because Germany seemed to oppose it. The belief followed the impulse.
Wow, that's a subtle but powerful point about self-deception. So aggression and resistance were the main currents. What about people not swept up in those?
Russell mentions a few other responses. There were groups whose national feeling was aimed against the state they lived in, like the Irish or Poles at the time. Their impulses were similar in nature, he thought, just operating in different circumstances, seeing their own nation as the one being resisted.
And then the pacifists. Weren't they just seen as cold and passionless?
That was the common accusation, that they lacked vitality. Russell acknowledges some pacifists might fit that bill, people whose impulses were maybe weaker, atrophied, simply abstaining without strong conviction. He even controversially suggests a nation with strong, even destructive impulses might have more potential for good eventually than one where impulse is dead, because impulse is life force.
But active pacifists were different in his view.
Completely different. He argues active pacifists are not lacking passion. They're driven by a very strong life-affirming impulse that is fundamentally hostile to the death drive of war.
It takes energy to stand against the tide like that.
Immense energy. Standing against overwhelming public opinion, especially during wartime patriotism, requires significant impulse, he says. Not just cool reason, it's that direct and uncalculating impulse for peace or life that gives them the strength.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So what are these life-affirming impulses that he thinks we should be encouraging?
He focuses on three he believes aren't actually that rare and could be much more common if our institutions were better: love, the instinct of constructiveness, and the sheer joy of life.
Love, building things, enjoying life. Seems pretty basic. But he thinks our current setup actively hinders these.
That's his core critique. He sees institutions built on injustice, rigid authority, and a narrow focus on conventional success as actively checking and weakening these positive impulses. By forcing people into roles where they're just carrying out someone else's purpose, not their own. This leads to feelings of impotence, he says, a loss of joy, a kind of soul weariness, and a narrowing of vision. You have to kind of shut down parts of yourself, empathy, creativity, to fit into systems that are fundamentally unfair or unfulfilling.
But he doesn't think this is inevitable. He sees hope.
Absolutely. He insists these negative effects can be ended by wisdom and courage. He truly believes that changing our institutions could reshape our impulsive life, leading to a new happiness and a new vigor. That hope fuels his whole analysis.
He uses this really vivid metaphor, the central principle of growth in each person, like a tree reaching for sunlight.
It's a great image, isn't it? He sees our key impulses and desires stemming from this core urge, this instinctive urgency, pushing us in a certain direction unique to each person.
And when that growth is blocked,
It gets distorted. It doesn't just stop. It often twists into something harmful. Injurious impulses, he calls them.
things that hurt ourselves, like addictions, or things that hurt others.
Yes, he suggests impulses that injure others often result from thwarted growth. People who've had the chance for unimpeded natural development tend to be less destructive, less malevolent.
And institutions are the environment, the soil for this growth. They can help or hinder.
Exactly. And it's complex. Your growth depends on beliefs, relationships, opportunities, the whole life of the community around you. A developed person's growth is deeply intertwined with the state of society. Its failures stunt you. Its successes nourish you.
But he argues our modern institutions are often based on outdated models of authority that actually prevent this growth.
That's right. He traces it back to models inherited from simpler, more hierarchical ages: the despotic ruler, the unquestioned religious authority, the feudal lord, the patriarchal father. These systems assumed only a select few were meant to grow freely. Everyone else was there to serve their purposes.
And that old structure started breaking down.
It did, mainly because it couldn't meet basic demands for justice and liberty. As rulers abused power, people fought back, asserting their own individual rights.
But that fight had a side effect.
Yes, it tended to make individuals into separate, self-contained units, focused on their own rights against others or against authority. In fighting against the old system, they lost that sense of a shared, organic purpose, however flawed the old one was.
Which might explain some of the alienation in modern life.
Russell certainly implies that. He even suggests the appeal of war, for some, was that it seemed to restore that feeling of common purpose, even if it was a destructive one focused on hating an enemy.
So the fight for freedom, starting way back with things like the Reformation, it paradoxically made people more isolated, maybe harder.
He sees it as a difficult consequence. The necessary battle against unjust authority hardened the walls of the ego. It made genuine connection and cooperation harder. It led to this constant strife between tradition and liberty, often descending into just self-assertion on both sides.
And then the really bitter twist. The group that wins its freedom often becomes the new oppressor.
He calls nationalism the most crude example of this. A nation fights for its freedom from an oppressor, justifying it with high ideals. Nation A is fighting backward Nation B.
Right. But once Nation A wins, the same energy, the same national pride, if it's still rooted in that narrow self-assertion, often turns outwards. Suddenly, they might deny liberty to a smaller Nation C within their new borders.
Nation A tells Nation C, "You want freedom from us. Don't be absurd. You're not ready for it."
Exactly. He cites examples like France after freeing itself from England, then conquering Italy, or Germany's journey from resisting Napoleon to becoming aggressive itself. The underlying impulse remains, just finds a new target.
So just trying to prop up those old authority structures won't work. They contain the seeds of their own conflict.
Right. Russell argues that once injustice is widely felt, trying to force people back into submission just damages everyone. It hardens those ego prisons. What's needed, he says, for healthy individual growth is contact with others based on free cooperation, not enforced service.
Equality and mutual freedom. Yes. Which means future institutions have to be built on voluntary combination, not coercion or blind tradition. And he's radical here. This means fundamental changes to the state, private property, the traditional family, churches, armies, the lot.
Okay, so if we move towards voluntary association, what actually makes those positive connections happen between people?
He boils it down to two main sources: instinctive liking and having a common purpose.
Instinctive liking, just that feeling of warmth or ease with someone.
Yeah, from intense love down to just a faint sense of pleasure in someone's company. He even notes, maybe a bit cynically, that a shared aversion can create a kind of liking, like two people bonding over their dislike of a third party.
He contrasts Carlyle and Walt Whitman on this, doesn't he?
It's a brilliant comparison. Carlyle, full of instinctive aversion, finding fault everywhere, despising weakness, and Whitman radiating this warm, expansive feeling, delighting in almost everyone, which fuels his optimism and democratic spirit.
And Russell sides with Whitman not because it's more logical, but because it leads to a better, happier world.
Precisely. We should want to foster instinctive liking because it leads to more satisfaction and less conflict. So, institutions should be judged partly on whether they encourage that warmth or hinder it.
And the second source is common purpose, working together on something.
Yes, like in unions or political groups, though he adds a critical note. Many modern economic setups fail here. For most workers, the only shared purpose is getting paid, which he sees as a major flaw that movements like syndicalism aimed to fix.
And these two things, liking and purpose, often intertwine.
Definitely. Marriage often starts with liking, then children provide a strong common purpose. Nations, he suggests, are often built on a faint liking for familiar ways, maybe boosted by a shared dislike of foreigners, and then strengthened by a common purpose like defense.
So institutions that allow people to grow naturally need to foster both common goals and that basic human connection.
Exactly, they feed each other. Thwarted growth, blocked purposes, these destroy liking and breed hatred, resentment, what he calls the malevolence that comes from being stunted. True freedom, allowing natural growth, should therefore reduce hatred.
Which leads back to his point that human nature isn't fixed, it can be changed.
He's adamant about this. The belief that human nature cannot be changed is one of the obstacles to progress, he writes. Our characters are shaped by everything: beliefs, conditions, institutions. The Dutch and Germans might seem to have different instincts, but that's circumstance. Celibacy changes people. The form an instinct takes depends entirely on the outlets available.
So the same basic energy could fuel art or war, depending on the channels society provides.
That's the core idea, which also means simply punishing bad behavior isn't very effective.
Why not?
Because punishment usually relies on appealing to self-interest, avoid the penalty. But Russell thinks self-interest is weak compared to strong impulses. Punishment doesn't erase the impulse, it just tries to redirect it, often badly. And we're great at tricking ourselves into thinking our self-interest aligns with our impulses anyway.
So what does drive fundamental changes in human nature over time? Not just ideas.
He points mainly to material changes, shifts in climate, new technologies, scientific discoveries, things that alter daily life and social structure on a mass scale, like the Industrial Revolution.
These change how we live, which changes our instincts and beliefs.
Right. But the problem is our big institutions, state, property, family, church, army, have inertia. They were built for older conditions and tend to persist long after those conditions change. They become outdated, ill-fitting, and end up opposing the life shaped by the new reality. They become oppressive.
And this is why just focusing on economics, like some political movements do, is a mistake in his view.
Yes. He thinks the economic reasons given for war, for instance, are often superficial. Industrial society, he argues, has left many crucial non-economic needs deeply unsatisfied. Human beings need more than just material goods.
So what are those vital needs that better institutions should aim to satisfy?
He lists several. More freedom, more chances for self-direction, more outlets for creativity, more opportunities for simple joy in life, more voluntary cooperation, and less being forced to serve purposes that aren't truly yours.
That's the path forward. Using our knowledge not just for stuff, but for a better quality of life.
That's his vision. Using our power over nature to build institutions that actually nourish the human spirit, meet these deeper needs, and allow for that natural growth towards a genuinely good life.
It's a really profound connection he draws, from deep psychology right up to the structure of our societies. So boiling it down, Russell says we're driven more by impulse than we admit. Institutions shape these impulses for good or ill, and our hope lies in shifting from authority-based systems to voluntary ones that foster connection, purpose, and growth.
Yeah, it's a call to look beneath the surface reasons we give ourselves, understand those powerful undercurrents, and consciously design a world that channels them towards flourishing, not frustration and conflict.
It definitely makes you think differently.
Yeah.
So, considering Russell's point about blind impulse driving so much of our behavior, how much of your own daily life, when you really think about it, might be running on those deep, maybe unconscious impulses rather than clear desires or reasons? And how might the institutions around you, work, community, politics, be shaping those impulses without you even realizing it?